The judge is staring at me like I have lost my mind. And perhaps I have, because what I am about to do, what I have decided, in this cold Parisian courtroom with its high ceilings and its rows of powdered wigs and its audience of people who came here expecting to watch me be destroyed, is not what anyone in this room is expecting. My husband's lawyer is standing there with his chest full of confidence and his mouth full of accusations, asking the court to make Armand pay 20,000 livres for the crime of loving me. 20,000 livres. As though I am a piece of furniture that was borrowed without permission and returned with a scratch. My husband, the Comte de Vauclaire, is sitting 3 rows back in his fine coat, looking like a man who has already won. He has not looked at me once since I walked in. He never really looked at me. Not once in 4 years of marriage did he look at me the way Armand looks at me. Like I am a person, like what I think matters, like I exist beyond what I can do for his reputation and his dinner table and his political standing in the salons of Paris. He wants the court to punish Armand for taking me away from him. What he does not know, what none of them know yet, is that I am about to tell this courtroom exactly what kind of husband he has been. Every detail, every name, every evening he paraded me in front of his friends like a trophy he was generously sharing. I am going to say it all out loud, in front of every powdered wig in this room. And by the time I am finished, the only question left will be whether this court has the honesty to look my husband in the eye and call him what he is. He came here for 20,000 livres. He is going to leave with 1 coin. Before we go any further, this story is entirely fictional. Any resemblance to real persons or places is purely coincidental. Now drop your location in the comments right now. It genuinely amazes me where these stories reach. If you are new here, subscribe before this video ends. This channel runs on persistence, and every single subscriber is proof that showing up matters. And here is the question I want you to hold in your mind for this entire story. If the only way to save the person you love was to expose every shameful secret your husband had spent years hiding, would you do it, knowing it would destroy your reputation forever? Céleste Beaumont was 20 years old when she married the Comte de Vauclaire, and she did it the way most women of her class and era married. Not because she chose him, but because the choice had already been made for her by people who believed they were acting in her best interest. Her family was respectable, but not wealthy. The Beaumont name carried enough social weight to get them into the right rooms in Paris, but not enough money to stay there comfortably. The Comte de Vauclaire solved that problem neatly. He was 15 years older than Céleste, well-connected, financially secure, and regarded in Parisian high society as an excellent match. Her parents used words like fortunate and well-situated when they spoke about the arrangement. What they meant was that the debt pressures quietly suffocating the Beaumont household would disappear the moment Céleste said yes. And that was reason enough. Nobody asked Céleste what she thought. This was not considered unusual. The Comte was not a violent man. This is important to say clearly, because the story of a bad marriage does not always involve bruises. What he was, with a consistency that wore her down far more effectively than cruelty would have, was indifferent. He had wanted a wife who would look correct on his arm at social events, manage his household without troubling him with the details, and reflect well on his standing among the powerful men he spent his time cultivating. Céleste fulfilled all of these functions adequately and was acknowledged for none of them. He spoke to her at dinner when conversation was required. He escorted her to the theater and the salons and the grand gatherings of Parisian nobility, because a man of his position was expected to appear with his wife. And then he spent those evenings talking to everyone except her, and the carriage ride home was always silent, and she would sit across from him in the dark and feel, with increasing clarity, that she was not a wife so much as a very well-dressed piece of the Comte's furniture. What made it worse What made it the specific and suffocating kind of loneliness that is harder to explain than simple unhappiness was that the Comte was perfectly pleasant to her in the technical sense. He did not shout. He provided everything she materially needed. If she had tried to describe her marriage to anyone in their social circle, she would have sounded ungrateful, because the language available to women in her position to describe what was wrong did not really exist yet. There was no word for a husband who was present in every room and absent from every conversation. There was no vocabulary for a marriage that functioned perfectly on the outside and felt like slow suffocation on the inside. This is not ancient history. Women have been told to be grateful for exactly this kind of marriage across every era and every culture. The setting changes. The silence does not. Into this silence came Armand Valcourt. He was the Comte's closest friend, or at least the man the Comte called his closest friend, which in the social world of Parisian nobility meant the man he most enjoyed being seen with and most trusted to be useful. Armand was different from the Comte in almost every meaningful way. He was warm where the Comte was cool. He was genuinely curious about people, what they thought, what they had read, what they actually believed beneath the performance that Parisian society required everyone to maintain at all times. He had a habit of asking questions and then listening to the answers that Céleste found so disorienting at first that she actually did not know how to respond to it. She had spent 4 years in a marriage where her opinions were neither requested nor acknowledged. A man who asked what she thought and then waited to hear it felt in the most unsettling way, like a foreign country. She did not fall in love with him immediately. That is not how it worked, and it would not be honest to tell it that way. What happened first was friendship, built slowly across the dozens of social occasions where Armand was present as the Comte's companion and therefore, by proximity, present in Céleste's world. A conversation at a dinner party where he disagreed with something the Comte said and turned to Céleste and asked what she thought. Not rhetorically, but actually. A walk in the gardens of a mutual friend's estate where they ended up talking for 2 hours about everything except the things people at that level of society were supposed to talk about. Small moments, accumulating quietly over 2 years, each one a reminder that being genuinely seen by another person was possible, and that she had been surviving without it for a very long time. The Comte noticed none of this, and this is where his behavior moves from mere indifference into something that the courtroom would later find very difficult to look at directly. Because the Comte de Vauclaire was not simply unaware of the growing closeness between his wife and his best friend. There were evenings, and Céleste would describe these later with a precision that silenced the courtroom, where the Comte had actively placed her in Armand's company, encouraged the conversation, refilled the wine, excused himself at the precise moment when doing so created the maximum opportunity for the two of them to be alone. He was not an unintelligent man. He knew what he was watching develop, and he said nothing, did nothing, redirected nothing. He allowed it to grow with the specific passivity of a man who has calculated that the outcome is useful to him in ways he has not yet needed to explain to anyone. This is the behavior that would eventually cost him everything in that courtroom. Not his wife's love for another man, his own deliberate orchestration of the conditions that made it possible, followed by his decision to profit from it legally when it suited him to do so. By the time Céleste and Armand left Paris together in the early spring, taking a carriage south toward Lyon without telling anyone until they were already gone, the Comte's response was not the grief of a betrayed husband. It was the cold calculation of a man who had just identified the mechanism by which he could extract 20,000 livres from his best friend and simultaneously destroy his wife's reputation so thoroughly that she could never credibly speak against him in any public forum again. He filed the lawsuit within the week. The charge was what the French legal world of that era called a criminal conversation suit. essentially a legal action against the man who had slept with another man's wife, framed not as a moral grievance, but as a property claim. The wife, under the laws governing marriage at that time, was legally the husband's. Another man sleeping with her was treated by the court not as a matter between people with feelings, but as a form of theft. One man's property interfered with by another. 20,000 livres was the figure the Comte placed on what had been taken from him. The figure was designed to ruin Armand. The lawsuit was designed to reduce Céleste to a scandalous footnote. What neither of them had accounted for was that Céleste had been paying very close attention for 4 years, and she had a very good memory. And she had decided that if this courtroom was going to be used as a weapon against the man she loved, she was going to walk into it and take the weapon apart piece by piece with her bare hands. She had told Armand what she was planning to do. He had told her it would destroy her socially, that no woman of her standing had ever done anything like it, that the scandal would follow her for the rest of her life. She had listened to all of this carefully and then told him that her reputation inside a world that had never once treated her as a full person was not something she was prepared to spend 20,000 livres protecting. The morning the trial began, she walked into that courtroom and sat down and waited for her moment. It did not take long to arrive. The Comte's lawyer made a confident opening. He had every reason to be confident. The facts of the case as he presented them were simple and damaging. The Comtesse de Vauclaire had left her husband for his closest friend, had abandoned the marital home without warning, and had been living with Armand Valcourt in a manner that left no room for charitable interpretation. The Comte, he argued, was a wronged man seeking lawful compensation from the man who had betrayed his trust and dishonored his household. The 20,000 livres was not greed. It was justice. The courtroom was full. These cases always drew an audience in Paris. There was something about watching a noble marriage collapse in public that the city found irresistible, and the gallery was packed with exactly the kind of well-dressed, sharp-eyed observers who would carry every detail of the proceedings into the salons and dinner parties of the city by nightfall. The Comte sat in his fine coat, looking like a man performing patience. Armand sat very still and looked at his hands. Céleste sat upright and looked at the judge. When her moment came, she took it without hesitation. What she did was simple in structure and devastating in effect. She told the court the truth. Not a partial truth, not a carefully managed account designed to minimize damage. The complete and specific and unflinching truth about what her marriage had actually been, and what her husband had actually done, and what the word betrayal genuinely meant in the context of everything she was about to describe. She told them about the evenings. The specific evenings where her husband had not simply tolerated her growing friendship with Armand, but had actively created the conditions for it. The strategic exits from rooms, the refilled wine glasses, the pointed encouragement of conversations between the two of them that the Comte had then absented himself from. She described these occasions with dates and details precise enough that they could not be dismissed as exaggeration or bitterness. She was not performing anger. She was giving testimony, and the difference between those two things was written clearly on her face. And then she went further. Because the Comte's behavior with Armand was not, she told the court, an isolated pattern. She named other men, not with relish. Anyone looking for cruelty in her manner that day would not have found it, but with clarity and with the calm of a woman who has decided that the truth is the only thing she has left, and she is going to use it completely. She described, one by one, specific occasions where her husband had placed her in the company of specific men, had created opportunities, had been present and aware, and entirely unbothered by what he was watching unfold. She gave names. She gave details. She gave the court the specific and documented portrait of a husband who had spent years treating his wife not as a person to be protected, but as a social instrument to be deployed. and who had now arrived in this courtroom demanding 20,000 livres for the consequences of his own deliberate behavior. The room had gone very quiet by the time she finished. The Comte's lawyer attempted a recovery. He challenged her account, questioned her reliability as a witness, suggested that a woman who had abandoned her marital home was not a credible source on the subject of her own marriage. These were the standard tools available to men in his position in that era, and he used them competently. But the problem he faced was the same problem the Comte himself had created. Celeste's account was too specific, too detailed, and too consistent to be dismantled by insinuation alone. Every name she had named was a name the court could pursue. Every occasion she had described had witnesses who could be located. She had not walked into this courtroom with feelings. She had walked in with evidence. The jury deliberated for a short time. They returned a verdict in favor of the Comte. Technically, he had filed a legal claim, and the law required them to acknowledge it. But the damages they awarded him for the theft of his wife, for the dishonor done to his household, for the 20,000 livres he had demanded as the price of what had been taken from him were as follows. 1 livre, a single coin, the smallest meaningful amount the law allowed. Not a clerical error. Not a compromise. A verdict, delivered in a packed Parisian courtroom with every powdered wig in the gallery watching. That said, without needing to use any of these words directly, that this court had heard what kind of husband this man had been, and had decided that what had been done to him was worth exactly 1 coin, and that he should take it and sit down. The Comte stood up and left the courtroom without looking at his wife. Armand exhaled for what felt like the first time in months. Céleste sat still for a long moment and looked at the single livre sitting on the table in front of her husband's lawyer, and felt something she had not felt in 4 years of marriage. The specific and clarifying sensation of having told the complete truth in a public place and survived it. But here is where the story refuses to become simple, because simple would not be honest. The 1 livre verdict did not free her. Under French law at that time, a wife could not simply choose to leave her marriage because a courtroom had humiliated her husband. Divorce existed in theory, but was enormously difficult in practice, requiring processes that were expensive, slow, and heavily weighted against women who had already been publicly identified as the party who had left. Céleste had won the moment. She had not won her freedom. She would spend years in the complicated legal and social territory between a marriage that was over in every real sense and a marriage that the law still recognized as intact. The world she had grown up in would never fully receive her back. The scandal she had created by speaking the truth out loud in that courtroom followed her into every room she entered for the rest of her life in Paris. She left Paris eventually. She and Armand built something quieter and more honest in a smaller city in the south of France, away from the salons and the powdered wigs and the social machinery that had spent years treating her as a component rather than a person. It was not the life she had been raised to expect. It was the life she had chosen with full knowledge of what choosing it would cost, and that knowledge, the specific dignity of a choice made with open eyes, was something nobody could take a legal pen to. The Comte de Vauclaire died some years later, still technically her husband, having never recovered his social standing from the afternoon a courtroom full of Paris's finest had awarded him 1 coin for his trouble. His name survived in a few administrative records. Céleste's name survived in something harder to erase: the retelling of what she had done in that room, passed from person to person across the decades. The story of the woman who walked into a courtroom that was supposed to destroy her and took it apart from the inside with nothing but the truth. She had been given 1 coin's worth of justice by a system that was never designed to give her any. She had decided that was enough to build on, and she built. This is the moral that this story carries, and it is not a comfortable one. Céleste did not escape cleanly. She did not receive a triumphant vindication. She paid for the truth with her reputation, her social world, her city, and years of legal and personal uncertainty. The sacrifice she made was not a sacrifice that led immediately to reward. It was the sacrifice of everything familiar in exchange for the integrity of her own account, with no guarantee of what came after. But there is a specific kind of courage that does not get celebrated enough. Not the courage of the battlefield or the grand gesture, but the courage of the person who sits in a room full of people who expect her silence, opens her mouth, and says the true thing anyway, knowing the cost, paying it, and living afterwards as the person who did not let fear of consequence rewrite her into someone she was not. The Comte wanted 20,000 livres and got 1 coin. Céleste wanted her life back and got something harder and more real. The knowledge that she had told the truth when it mattered, and that the truth had been enough. That is what sacrifice actually looks like. Not a clean victory, not a rescue, just a woman, a courtroom, and the decision to speak, and the long, difficult, irreplaceable life that becomes possible on the other side of that decision. People always ask about the 1 shilling. Here is the simple answer. In criminal conversation cases in 1780s England, the jury decided how much the wife was worth based on how honorable she was. Lady Worsley's lawyers revealed that her husband Sir Richard had actively encouraged her affairs, even watching through a bathhouse window on one occasion. The jury decided that a husband who behaved that way had no honor left to compensate. 1 shilling was not a mistake. It was the jury's way of publicly calling him out without using those exact words.